Okay, well, thanks very much for inviting me to talk to this great looking conference. I look very much forward to seeing the other papers. Yeah, anyway, thanks to Olivier, Anouk, Stephanie. So I am talking about prediction markets. The talk is not very philosophical, so apologies. And I really liked, Olivier, that you said it's an interdisciplinary conference because this is not very philosophical at all. It's very, very simply structured. It has three parts. I'm going to talk about a problem. Then I'm going to talk about a proposal that has been made to solve that problem. And then I'm going to mention some criticisms of this proposal. And all of that, of course, in the context of the replication crisis. So what is the problem? Well, the problem is that the system is broken. And of course, by system, I mean the system of scientific research. And one aspect of the problem that I want to focus on is essentially, and because of its relevance to the replication crisis, is the poor incentive structure that academics are facing, that researchers, scholars are facing. And and one of the aspects of that problem is that current practices in academia make tenure decisions, promotion decisions, funding decisions, dependent on a certain set of measurable criteria, such as the number of publications that one has, the rankings of the journals in which these publications appear, and the number of citations each of these publications garners. So the number and quality of those citations, which, you know, where were they cited, and so on. We all know that, right? But then because of peer reviewing and what I want to call the reviewer's conservative bias for novelty. So, I mean, that's a bit of a contradiction in terms, but what I mean by that is that every paper has to make a novel contribution, but it somehow has to be a minimal, a contribution that is, you know, that doesn't exactly repeat what has been said before, but that extends what is already accepted in a minimal way, in a conservative way. So that's what I mean for by conservative bias for novelty, right? So you're not supposed to make radically new claims, but there has to be a little bit, you know, a little bit in addition in a new claim. So anyway, because of peer reviewing and reviewers' conservative bias for novelty, the system provides adverse incentives to prioritize quantity over quality. So essentially you have a great idea, but then you don't publish the great idea, but you break it up into, as you know, the smallest, sometimes it's called the smallest publishable unit. So, you know, into very small parcels that you can individually publish. But also, of course, in general, the quality suffers, right? So because you have to publish, you don't look so carefully, let's say it that way. But also, you have an incentive against looking too carefully at existing work because you want to appear novel, right? And so you don't want to take full account of all that existing work. You do have to cite it, of course, but you don't want to take full account in your, you know, in your own work of that existing work. And lastly, you have an incentive to investigate questions and use methods in ways that satisfy peer reviewers rather than nature and scientific or public interests, right? And so because you have to go, I mean, in order to publish, you have to go through peer review. You do want to focus on questions that interest peer reviewers and not that are of general interest or of your personal interest or public interest. And also you want to use the methods, not methods that are the most adequate given the nature of the problem, and that's what I call nature here, given the nature of the problem, but rather methods that satisfy peer reviewers. And then, interestingly, neither citations nor journal rankings actually, and I was shocked to see these findings, neither citations nor journal rankings are indicative of the quality of the work. And I just want to give two examples here. So this graph is a study from the replication project in psychology. And here 100 papers in really good psychology journals have been tried to replicate. 61 of those, actually a majority, did not replicate. But what is interesting is that, and they were all published in 2008. And what is interesting is that the citation rates are exactly identical. In some cases, exactly identical. In some cases, very close, whether or not these papers replicated. And so you have two lines here, one about direct citations, and then about second degree, so citations of citations, right? And they're essentially identical. So it doesn't matter whether it's a good study or not. Once the study is out, it will be cited. So that is one really shocking result. The other shocking result is that, so what you have here is, in one dimension, you have the journal H-index, so which is an indication of the journal ranking. Of course, it's also a measure of citations, but it is used as a proxy for journal quality or journal ranking. And on the other axis, you have the estimated, and I will talk about that, the estimated probability of replication. And what you find here is that there is no correlation. So you find good and bad studies, both in the best ranked or in the highest cited journals, and good and bad papers, or replicable and not replicable papers in the worst journals. And this is across all or many fields within the social and behavioral sciences. But if you look at individual sciences, you find the same lack of correlation. So for example, on top here, I don't know if I can, there's no pointer here, right? But essentially, if you look at the top of the graph, you have something like orangey, yellowish, brownish, orangey. You have the economics papers. And there are some papers that have some journals that have a very high H-index, such as the American Economic Review on the top right. And then you have journals with a very low index, such as Experimental Economics, all the way on the left. And both have very replicable, both publish very replicable studies. So even within each field, you find no correlation between the quality of the journal or the H-index of the journal and the degree with which the study replicates, which seems problematic. So what then is the proposal I want to discuss here? And essentially the idea is that we should create markets for ideas, to create an institution of exchange for ideas, for ideas. And the one of the main figures behind this movement, or like that advocates ideas futures, is this guy called Robin Hanson, who's a professor of economics at George Mason University, and has worked on many things. His latest book is called The Elephant in the Brain, which is about sort of subconscious motivations. And he argues that, in fact, very often we are not aware of the true motivation for doing X, Y, or Z, but that has evolutionary advantages, that we don't know why we do a certain thing. But anyway, he's written a lot on futures markets, on markets, in particular, the application of prediction markets to scientific ideas. And so anyway, that's the main thing. And here I want to give an example that the idea is actually very old. So this is a quotation from, and this is taken from one of Hanson's papers, from 1651, where chemical physicists who were not accepted by the mainstream make the following proposal in order to find out what treatments help for medical purposes. Oh, your schools, let us take out of the hospitals, out of the camps or from elsewhere, 200 or 500 poor people that have fevers, pleurisy, and so on. Let us divide them into halves, let us cast lots, but one half of them may fall to my share and the other to yours. We shall see how many funerals both of us shall have, but let the reward of the contention or wager be 300 florins, deposited on both sides. here's your business, here your business is decided. And so there are actually two ideas in this. One is the idea of an RCT, which I didn't actually know that it was way back from the 17th century, but it's also the idea of put your money where your mouth is, right? So we can actually, I put my money where my, I think my treatment is a better one, and I will bet my money on that. So that's the idea. That is the basic idea of ideas, futures, or prediction markets as applied to science. Put your money where your mouth is. And in this case, one bets on the future settlement of a present scientific controversy. And the mechanism is that a financial institution, it doesn't really matter, it can be an individual, it can be a bank or whatever, sells pairs of coupons that say the following: you get 10 euros if the claim, some scientific claim, is confirmed, and a second coupon that pays 10 euros if by a certain date the claim X is not confirmed, to anyone for 10 euros. So there are always these pairs of bets, one in favor, one against. And because of that, because it, you know, the bank sells this pair at exactly the price that the coupon pays, the bank takes no risk. But also the bank can actually take the money and over the term, over the maturity, can actually invest it and through that pay for the overhead. For example, there has to be a judge who decides whether the claim is true or not, whether the claim is confirmed or not, and it can pay for that or its own overhead. Right, so that's the idea. A buyer then can sell one of the tickets for a price proportional to his or her best estimation of the probability of the ticket winning. So for example, if I believe that some scientific claim is true, you know, 90%, then I can sell the is false ticket or is not confirmed ticket for at least €1, right? So that's the idea. And now what is possible, because there's a trade in these tickets, many individuals, not just scientists, but everyone, investors, private people, science journalists, whoever, can participate in this market. And each of these individuals possesses his or her situated knowledge about the likelihood of that claim bearing out. And they can all participate and thereby aggregate all that information that is in the market about that particular claim. And so the dispersed knowledge, this is a Hayekian idea, if you know Hayek's work on that. So this dispersed knowledge about the truth of the claim gets aggregated into a consensus estimate of the probability of the confirmation of the scientific claim. And Hansen discusses a number of examples. So Alfred, you probably know the story that Alfred Wegener, a German geologist, proposed in 1915 his theory of a continental drift. At the time, and this just illustrates how prediction markets can give a better estimate of the truth of a hypothesis than the official scientific consensus. So he proposed in 1915 the hypothesis or the theory of continental drift, and he was laughed at essentially. However, there were a number of geologists who actually believed in the hypothesis. However, for reasons of sort of social norms and because, you know, this was just an impossible hypothesis to accept at the time, they did not, you know, they would not voice these concerns. They voiced them only privately, but not publicly. However, if there were market in ideas, they could anonymously participate in the market and thereby providing a more accurate estimate of the probability of that claim. And as you all know, later, like in the 1960s, this hypothesis was confirmed, and so Wegener was right, but initially he was laughed at, and he had the scientific consensus against him. With a prediction market, people would have an incentive to reveal maybe even anonymously, but through the market, their true estimation of the probability of the hypothesis. And similarly, you all know what's her name? Doesn't matter, but like anyway, the book Merchants of Doubt, where it's talked about that, you know, in some cases when there's a lot of sort of financial incentive, some industries may sponsor the publication of studies that shed a doubt on a scientific controversy. So, you know, does smoking cause lung cancer? Well, many studies show that it does, but then, you know, the cigarette industry, tobacco industry want, you know, fund studies that, you know, that want to undermine an emerging consensus. Here again, researchers who don't actually believe, you know, researchers within the cigarette industry would have an incentive privately to bet on the hypothesis against what they officially publish, and thereby provide a more accurate estimate of the probability of, let's say, smoking causes lung cancer. What's the promise? Well, prediction markets have been argued to help reach a consensus on scientific questions more efficiently, as I have just illustrated. And this is very important when we look at the role of science in society, to communicate this consensus to the general public. It's a lot faster than, for example, organizing a consensus conference and then, you know, using any of the methods of a consensus conference. And this, you could, in theory, publish in the newspaper or, you know, online or whatever, the daily estimate of probabilities of, you know, on all scientific questions that are currently being traded on a daily basis, right? And so the consensus or an estimate of the probability of, of the scientific consensus would emerge really quickly, and it could be very easily communicated. It could counteract inaccurate but popular beliefs, for example, about continental drift or about smoking causes lung cancer. It would also enable funders to incentivize research on questions they prioritize, and importantly, without having to commit funding to specific research groups. Because what funders could do is subsidize the gains of the bets. So the bank sells it at 10 euros, risk-free, right? Because it either gains or loses. Well, anyway, like, you know, either of the two tickets will win. But a funder could subsidize that and pay out more than the 10 euros, 20 euros, or 100 euros, or whatever, and thereby the winner of these bets would get some money and could thereby fund the investigation of that particular topic, right? But through that mechanism, funders could fund research questions without funding specific individuals or research groups. It, in a very obvious way, could also help set priors for Bayesian statistical inference, because essentially every hypothesis will have a probability. It could prioritize research questions for hypothesis testing by looking at, you know, market evaluations of these hypotheses. And it could help better capture how novel or surprising a result is. If you, as an individual, are a strong believer in a hypothesis, the market is against you, you can take out bets. And then if you win, you will win a lot of money, which is an excellent indicator of the novelty, of the unlikelihood, let's say, surprising, you know, the surprise of your hypothesis. Some details matter. One problem about which I will talk more in a minute is that the coupon would have to specify very, very clearly, very precisely, what is exactly the scientific claim at stake, the exact time at which the claim is to be resolved, and thirdly, the method of resolution, right? We need a clear, attestable prediction. That is very important. And therefore, it has been argued that the best use of prediction markets could be for predicting the results of specific experiments, such as experiments in psychology, in the psychology reproducibility project, which I already mentioned, right? And I will support this claim in what follows. Now, here's a concrete application of the idea of a prediction market applied to science. It's called the Replication Market, which is run by the Center for Open Science. And the structure is roughly as follows. So anyone, it's closed now, but in the past, anyone could sign up to bid on the chance of a particular study in the social and behavioral sciences to replicate. And so the Center for Open Science selected 3,000 studies, and each one of them, was deemed eligible, and you could bet on the ability of that study to replicate later. Replication here is understood in a very specific way, namely as getting a statistically significant result in the same direction as the original claim, but using data that were not used in the original study. Very specific understanding, but we need that kind of specific understanding of, because you need a testable claim, and the testable claim is get a statistically significant result in the same direction using different data. The study is ongoing, and so we don't have all the results yet, but here's some early results, as well as other relevant results. So one main result is that the average replication probability, so that's not whether the paper actually replicates, but what the market says about the chances of replication, is 54%. So slightly higher than in the original replication project in psychology, but this is much broader and includes other fields such as economics. The market estimated predictions of replication differ markedly between different fields, exactly as we would expect. So here you see the estimated probabilities of replication for the different fields. And perhaps unexpectedly, economics is at the top with an average of about 63% or so, but then the bulk of the distribution really lying around 80%. And then the lowest is in marketing, management and marketing, where the estimated replication probability is below 50% actually, and other fields in the social sciences in between, social and behavioral sciences in between. Now, there are other earlier studies that show that prediction markets work really well to estimate replication. So the chances are that these are reliable figures about the actual replication rates of these studies. So that is important. Now, the last part of my talk, the critique. What are the problems with this approach? And a one sentence summary is, well, the idea of futures markets in ideas of prediction markets has great promise in principle, but it's difficult to implement in practice. And I want to make three arguments here. One is that markets or prediction markets do not work very well for long-term forecasts. However, science tends to be very slow. So aside from the problem that the resolution of scientific disputes obtains is at all at an unknown date in the future, prediction markets are suited to applications in science because science simply moves slowly. And I just want to give one example from my own field, economics. The most cited, the most famous article in economic methodology is Friedman 53, the methodology of positive economics, where he makes a point about the distinction between positive and normative economics. He essentially said, like, there's a strict separation, and one thing that's characteristic about normative ideas is that basically we all agree. We all agree on values. We all agree, for example, that a job should give you a living wage. So you should be able to survive and live well on your salary. We all agree on that. However, there are, between the left and the right, different opinions about how best to achieve that goal. the goal of the living wage. And one of the hypotheses that are disputed between the left and the right are the effectiveness of minimum wages to help with that goal. So the left essentially said, let's institute minimum wages, or let's increase existing minimum wages so that workers have a higher salary in order to, get them closer to the goal of achieving a living wage. Economists on the right tend to say, well, we can do that, and it will increase the salaries of existing workers, but at the same time, it will increase unemployment, it will kick a lot of workers out of their jobs, and therefore, on average, create a situation that is worse than without the minimum wage. That was in 1953 when Friedman talked about this dispute. Today, almost 70 years later, we have exactly the same controversy and exactly the same positions with exactly the same two camps arguing exactly the same thing. So 70 years later, we haven't had an agreement, even though we've had a great development of econometric techniques, a lot more data, but we still don't know more. So science moves slowly, if at all. And so prediction markets then work best in the short term and can actually be substantially biased when maturities are long. And so here are just a couple of aspects of that problem. Prices of long-term prediction markets are systematically biased towards the half-half, 50% prediction. And that's just a general observation, a general fact about betting markets, that bets about favorites tend to be underestimated and bets about long shots tend to be overestimated, creating bias towards the 50% prediction. And the important thing is, so this exists in all betting markets. There are a number of explanations for that, actually. One is the behavioral economics explanation that people overestimate small probabilities and underestimate high probabilities. But that's just one explanation. The fact is relatively undisputed. What is relevant here is that this bias increases the longer the maturity. So it's essentially wiped out if you bet on an event that's tomorrow. But you have a very large bias for an event that is in a few months, and actually in the financial markets, the long-term maturity is something like 2 months, right? And in science, of course, that is very, very short term, right? But anyway, the longer the maturity, the longer the term, the higher the bias towards 50%. And also long-term markets, in part for that reason, long-term prediction markets are typically characterized by a low level of trading volume, which then undermines the information aggregation property of the market. And therefore, because they're thin, they may be too unattractive to generate any trade at all. But that means a lot of potential participants who have information will not trade, which means that after all, the market actually does not aggregate the information that exists in the market. And so the point about this is that prediction markets may work well for a specific replication exercise, but that doesn't mean that they work well to solve all the problems in science that I started with. So that was criticism number one. Criticism number two, operationalization. Prediction markets require testable predictions. However, it's really hard to make predictions that are unambiguous. One problem is obviously, what you're interested in is, at the end of the day, you want to know the truth of a hypothesis, right? Or at least the reliability or whatever. But you can't bet on truth because truth is unobservable. So you want to know whether it's true or not that minimum wages cause unemployment, but you cannot bet on that. So we could use substitutes, and in my description I used confirmed. You can use substitutes such as tested or confirmed. But the problem is, by and large, different studies will yield different results, and very often inconsistent results. So which ones do you take? And there's no gold standard of evidence. There's just as much debate about substantive issues, such as whether or not minimum wages cause unemployment, as there is about evidential standards. So it's very, very hard to actually operationalize the idea of betting in favor or against a scientific hypothesis. Nor are there straightforward measures of consensus. So you could, like in theory, bet on the emergence of a scientific consensus on a topic, but there are no straightforward measures of that. Moreover, using anything such as a judge or a group of judges, an expert committee to determine at the specific point in time whether a scientific claim is confirmed or not, essentially just brings us back to the problems prediction markets were supposed to solve to begin with, right? So that won't help. And again, we're in a good position when the application is a specific replication exercise, because here we have a specific date, we just say has to replicate, within this experiment that we're running by, I don't know, 31st of December 2020, and replication means what I said earlier, right? Statistically significant result in the same direction, but using different data. So all of this works really well, not in general, but for a specific replication exercise. Another thing is that prediction markets could cause biases or changes in scientific practice. So it's possible that the need to make unambiguous predictions, so if we had prediction markets on a large scale, this might have an adverse effect on scientific production. As an analogy, consider what I've worked on in earlier work, patenting and pills, right? So think of treatments of a certain disease, let's say depression. Because of the patenting system and the incentives patents introduce, there is a bias towards treatment recommendations that can be patented. Oh, okay, yeah, I'm gonna finish very, very, very soon. That can be patented, like pills, as pills can be patented, but recommendations such as go exercise can't be patented, and so there's a lot of funding for pills, but not very much funding. And similarly, prediction markets can create those kinds of adverse incentives. So research efforts will be directed towards projects that are short-term and quantifiable and away from basic research and research, let's say, in the humanities. But again, this is not too much of a problem for specific replication projects. And now, and this is, I can be very, very quick here actually, because this is what is going to, I'm sure what is going to be discussed at this workshop. So here's, replication markets work really well, prediction markets work really well for specific replication exercises. However, replication in that sense is neither necessary nor sufficient for truth or reliability. A true claim might not replicate simply because actually it's not the first study, the original study that is faulty, but the replication, because it's a fragile claim, it depends on specific details of the study, or it's not externally valid. If you use it on any other set of data, it was originally true, but it's simply not true in the other data set that it's being. And a claim that replicates might not be true because if you replicate a poorly designed study, that remains a poorly designed study, right? Also, another problem, I'm going to finish really in just 1 minute. Very often what happens is that a corollary is actually being replicated and not the main claim of the study. And so then the study is counted as replicated, but in fact, it's just an unimportant claim that was made in the study and not the study's main claim. And also, statistical significance doesn't entail substantive significance, but we all know that. Anyway, so we end up with what looks like a dilemma. Where they work best, prediction markets seem to help little to improve scientific practice, and where they could potentially contribute a great deal to improving scientific practice, they don't appear to work very well. So that's an unfavorable conclusion, but I find just to cushion that a little bit, any institution has to be judged relative to alternatives, and I have nothing said about prediction markets relative to peer review, for example. And so it might actually be that they work better, even if they, with all their problems, it might actually work better than peer review or consensus or whatever. And also, we haven't talked about the complementarity, actually introduce prediction markets alongside existing institutions. But these are work for, anyway, these are ideas for further work. So thank you.